Hello and welcome to our second lesson in this GCSE revision series on an inspector calls. Last week we went through the inspector as a character, we analysed him, we went through a model paragraph and some of the key quotes for him. And if you like this kind of content, please go and watch that and consider watching the rest of the series. Every week I'm going to be trying to give you key quotes and things that you need to do better in your GCSE exams. So that was last week. We did the inspector. This week we're going to be covering Mr. B, as in Mr. Birling, and thinking about him as a character. Throughout this series, we're also going to be going through some themes, some context, as I said, some model paragraphs. And if you have any feedback, any comments, feel free to put them in the video comments or on the Discord if you're part of that. So let's look at Mr. Birling. So as usual, we'll start by talking about Mr. Birling as a character first, so that you get a good understanding of him, how he fits into this play, his significance, what he represents. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes are kind of the points that you could put for your paragraphs. So quite often the character questions will be about how is a character presented? And effectively, these ideas that I'm giving you are the way you could start one of those paragraphs. So one of the things about Mr. Birling that is quite interesting about him is the fact that he has married up. What that means is he didn't start off in the upper class the way that his wife Sybil did. He was sort of a middle class man, and he worked hard and worked up to building a business. And from building that business, he then developed wealth, and part of being in the upper class, of course, traditionally has been being very wealthy. So then having the wealth that he did, having the business success that he did, afforded him the ability to actually potentially marry someone from the upper class. Normally middle class people wouldn't marry or even fraternize with the upper class, certainly not working class people. There was this very rigid class division in Edwardian England. And so it's unusual to have a person ascend up from a middle class to an upper class. And then even more rare, it did happen occasionally, but very more rare, would be a working class person getting to the upper class. And that's what we might colloquially call rags to riches. So he married up. One of the ways we know this is at the beginning of the play, he's described as being rather provincial in his speech. That's a quote. Let me add that for us, actually. Provincial in his speech. And the reason that that's important is provincial means from the provinces, more rural, more from a place that's not, basically a bit of an accent, a bit more of a country sort of accent. So this would have been quite unusual in the upper class circles, because they'd have all spoken very, very posh English, very, Queen's English, basically. And so one of the things about Arthur is that his wife is always trying to teach him how to be more upper class, and she tries to correct him and things like that. So that's quite an interesting part of his character. He represents a lot of things in the play. So as you know, J.B. Priestley is a socialist, and he writes this play as a kind of a political play to try and convince people that socialism is better than capitalism. So Arthur Birling is representing capitalism, and as a result of this, he's represented as corrupt and greedy and selfish. And you could say that it's almost not just a representation of capitalism, but what we call a caricature of capitalism, really, because people like Mr. Birling don't really probably exist. That he's almost like Mr. Burns or something from The Simpsons. He's like incredibly evil, effectively, in the way that he speaks and the way that he is. He also represents upper class greed. So as I said, he's married up, but now that he's there, he's obsessed with his wealth, he's obsessed with possessions, he's obsessed with building his business even bigger, making more money. And yet, paradoxically, the greed part, for example, he talks about having lower costs and higher prices. So that's quite interesting, because he doesn't want to pay his workers fairly. He doesn't want this. And in 1912 England, you could get away with that. Workers didn't have worker rights, really. There was no unionization of the workers at this point. And we'll come on to Eva Smith in the future, but Eva Smith, when she creates that protest and that strike, that workers' strike. These are the early beginnings of a unionization of workers, to sort of have a body of workers come together and say, no, you can't treat us however you want. You can't pay us how little you want. But Mr. Birling really exploits the fact that he doesn't have to pay them anything other than what he wants to pay them. And he just says, well, it's a free country. But obviously, as we learn, it's not a fully free country in 1912. Eva Smith doesn't have lots of opportunities. So it's quite heartless of him. And the other thing about him is that he represents business owners, but within this, he is quite ignorant as well. So part of his ignorance is the fact that he thinks that, oh, if you don't want to work at my factory for whatever it is, 20 shillings or 22 shillings or whatever it is, then you can just move to another job. It's a free country. That's quite ignorant, because there wasn't a lot of work, particularly for young women in 1912. It wasn't that easy for them to just, get a job and then to move to another place. There wasn't a huge amount of options. And guess what? Most of the factories and businesses were owned by wealthy upper class people. So there was effectively what we might call a ruling class, which they mostly knew each other, they fraternized with each other, they competed with each other. But so if Mr. Birling had wanted, he could easily have just said, oh, don't hire this Eva Smith lady, she's causing trouble. And then most of the factories probably wouldn't have hired her. So that's a big problem too. He also shows his ignorance through his lack of understanding of global politics and the world around him. So, in Act 1, he speaks a lot about how there's not ever going to be any war, and there are just a few silly Germans talking nonsense and so on. There are several quotes where he basically says there won't be war. So something else about An Inspector Calls is it was written and performed in 1945. So that's after World War I and after World War II. Yet it's set in 1912. So World War I started in 1914. So it's set just a couple of years before the First World War. So when Arthur Birling is talking about, oh, there's not going to be war, and then he even says, to Sheila and Eric and Gerald, you'll be throwing a little party, let's say in 1940. And obviously the audience would have been laughing and crying about this, because they'd have been like, this is so ignorant and stupid. In 1940, obviously, we were right in the middle of World War II. So they wouldn't be throwing parties and having a good time. They would be, scared for their lives and off fighting wars and trying to hold the country together. One of the most obvious ones as well to show his ignorance is he talks about the Titanic being unsinkable. Obviously, famously, the Titanic did sink. So there's a bit about him as an ignorant business owner. And that then puts into the reader or the audience's mind, should a man like Mr. Birling even be, in a position of leadership? Does he seem competent to do that? And then you might question capitalism further and say, is anyone competent to do that? And that's an interesting topic. In the interest of fairness, I'll just quickly say, obviously, this is pre-Soviet Union, pre a lot of the communist regimes that then came along, which obviously were horrifically terrifying, millions of people dead under those regimes, such as Stalinism, Maoism, and so on. So, there's definitely flaws and problems to capitalism. There are certainly also big flaws and problems with socialism and communism. So some of the central premises of the play are good, though. Be kind to each other. Money shouldn't be the most important thing. These are good messages, I think. He's also a selfish father figure. He presents himself as a father figure that is very selfish. So when Sheila is talking about marrying Gerald and Arthur is giving a toast to them, he talks more about how finally Birling and company can join forces with Crofts Limited. Gerald, the man that Sheila is marrying, is the son of Crofts Limited business owner, Lord Croft. So he cares more about his money and his power and how this marriage of his daughter is going to consolidate that power. And that represents a lot, sadly, of the way that the upper class did get married at that time. He cares a lot more about his public image than anything else. That's a huge flaw in his character. So he doesn't really care that Eva Smith has died. He doesn't care really at all about that. He doesn't care about much. He cares more about how it looks to the public. He wants to look good to the public. He wants to be looked up to by the public. And he wants to hide away any dark secrets that come out. And towards the end of the play, he even says to the inspector, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands. And we get this sense that he would even, in that moment, he's almost sort of bribing or trying to bribe the inspector subtly, like saying, look, I'll give you £1,000, just leave me alone. £1,000 back then would be like 100 grand or more in today's money. So this is a huge bribe. He's trying to protect his public image at all costs, because he understands that public image is so important to the upper class. I would say that he, something I haven't even mentioned yet, he's a static character. He doesn't, what that means is he doesn't develop or grow as a result of the experiences in the play. He learns a lot about the suffering of Eva Smith. He doesn't seem to care about it. He doesn't seem to care that she went off prostituting herself to try and earn money. He doesn't even seem to care that she's committed suicide, really. So he's very static, and he's clearly an antagonist character. He's villainous. He really only cares for himself. And there isn't really much redemption in him. I don't think that many people read about Mr. Birling and feel much sympathy for him or pathos. And I think that that's, again, by design. I think that J.B. Priestley has created a villainous character to villainize capitalism, because that's one of the points of the play, to villainize capitalism and to try and make socialism look like a better alternative. And a lot of people at the time did buy into this. So, for example, in 1945, the Labour Party in England won in a landslide victory with the Prime Minister known as Clement Attlee. In 1948, the NHS was founded, which is ultimately sort of a socially responsible medicine. So the thinking of people like J.B. Priestley was pretty popular in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I think now we have a bit more of a balanced approach because of things that happened, like I said, with the Soviet Union. We're skeptical of communism, but we're also skeptical of raw capitalism. So in England, we have what's called a mixed economy. So you can look that up if you want. That's good context for this. Final thing I'll say about Arthur Birling is all of this adds up to someone who seems like a bit of a psycho, really. He seems psychopathic. He doesn't seem to have the capacity even to care for others. He doesn't seem to even care for his children or wife. So there's a good chance that you could say that Arthur Birling is presented as a psychopath. And there are quite a few quotes that support that. So let's dive into some of those. Here are a few quotes that I'll go through with you. And then I think that we'll try and finish out with a model paragraph like normal. Just checking the time. So a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. So this quote here, clearly what is going on here is the imperative language, for example. It's very forceful tone. He's basically saying that he's got a very black and white vision of the world. He feels like, look, all a man has to do is this, this, and this, and that's all that matters. So there's no room for social responsibility in his worldview. He feels that you build your business, you mind your own business, you look after yourself, you look after your family, and basically screw everyone else. That's his mindset. And I think that a lot of people who would read that would, particularly in 1945, after the two world wars, would feel that it was a very selfish way of looking at the world, especially because they've just gone through a period of history where they spent almost all of their time looking after others as well as themselves, trying to defend each other in war, trying to keep the country running as we're in wartime. So this would have seemed very, very selfish and short-sighted and a bit ignorant, really. Lower costs and higher prices, I've already spoken about this. The other thing about this one is its juxtaposition. So the juxtaposition here shows that Mr. Birling is obsessed with money and he wants to maximize his profits. That's his biggest concern. The other thing that you could talk about with this one is the connotations of cost is really interesting. So to him, the cost of his business is his workforce. Now, nowadays, we tend to think of workers as assets. There are departments in businesses called human resources. So we see human beings, obviously, with value and dignity more now, which is a good thing, and worker rights and all of that good stuff. But at that point, he just saw them as a cost. It's a cost I've got to keep down. He didn't see them as human beings. He didn't see them as individuals with their own lives and hopes and dreams, like the inspector says, Eva Smiths and John Smiths with their hopes and dreams, right? He doesn't see any of that. He just sees a number on a sheet, and his job is to try and keep that number as low as possible, try and get as much out of his workforce as he can, paying them as little as possible. And there's no humanity to it. And that certainly is something that you can say about raw capitalism at its worst. It doesn't care enough about people. It's very important to have many of you will go on to be in business and run businesses. You need to think about the people that you're hiring and taking care of them. And so there is a lot to learn from Mr. Birling, the way that he is and the attitudes that he has. He describes himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. So hard-headed, this is Synecdoche. So Synecdoche is when part of something represents all of it. So his head being hard is meant to represent this stubbornness and this lack of empathy within him. Yeah, stern, hard, uncaring. And that really is Mr. Birling. I can't accept any responsibility. So the fact that he says that he can't accept any responsibility for any of what happens to Eva, again, sort of shows his immaturity, and it's a short, simple sentence which emphasizes this: immature, greedy, selfish, that sort of thing. He just doesn't really care. And even when he first finds out that Eva has been killed and burnt herself inside out by swallowing disinfectant, he goes, yes, terrible business, but I don't know what it has to do with me, Inspector. So even from the very first moment, there's no empathy, there's no sympathy. He just is like, well, what are you doing here? Why should I care about this? Terrible. He uses euphemism sometimes. So he talks about the girl's condition. This is euphemism because he doesn't want to really talk about the fact that his son has got her pregnant or any of the pain and suffering. So he uses euphemism. That also links to his public facing, his image, right? The fact that he wants to soften the language and try and get rid of any feelings of guilt he might have inside about what's going on. We talked about the Titanic, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, the repetition, it's humorous and it shows his ignorance, the fact that he doesn't realize that the Titanic will sink. Obviously, we all know that. So that's also known as dramatic irony. I don't like the tone nor the way you're handling this inquiry. So this is a power struggle. So another thing that you need to know about Mr. Birling is that there's a constant power struggle between him and the inspector. And so this is part of that. It's also, again, quite selfish, really, isn't it? Because, you know, his job is just to be interrogated by the authorities, yet he's trying to control that. Another thing that we could add in for him in that sense is he offers the inspector a glass of whiskey. So I don't remember the exact quote, but he offers alcohol to the inspector. So he's trying to corrupt the inspector. He's trying to get the inspector on his side because he understands that if he can own the police that are interrogating him, then he can get away with anything. And he even goes on to tell Inspector Gould, you know, I golf with your boss, Constable Colonel Roberts. And, you know, he's trying to intimidate the inspector. He's trying to grab power and he's trying to make sure that the inspector just toes the line, which obviously the inspector doesn't do. The fact that when the inspector enters, it's a sharp ring of a doorbell is quite interesting because this sort of symbolizes the sharp change of attitude of people. So, you know, it's a rude awakening to people that aren't catching up when we get workers' rights, when we get more socially responsible medicine and so on and so on. It's a sharp alarm to the people that are trying to hold that back, like Mr. Birling. Provincial in his speech, I've already said that shows he married up into upper class. So that's a good quote for that. He's portentous and heavy looking. These quotes go together. Last week, we were talking about how the inspector need not be a big man, but he conveys solidity and purposefulness. Well, Mr. Birling, he is an intimidating looking man. And you get the sense that one of the ways that he's risen to the top of capitalism is his intimidation, his aggression. And that, again, is not a positive thing. You know, if you're going to rise to the top of business, it should be because you're providing the best services or the best products, things that help people, things that add value, right? Yet we get the sense that that isn't really how Mr. Birling's got there. We get the sense that he got there more through corruption, more through bribery, more through, you know, owning the police force, being obsessed with his public image, all of that good stuff. Now, this is probably pushing it a little bit, but you could argue in some ways, especially to an audience of 1945 that would have been hyper aware of people like Adolf Hitler, there are some fascistic, you know, dictatorial, tyrant things to Mr. Birling that maybe the audience of 1945 may have noticed had some parallels with Hitler. Okay, so that's kind of pushing it quite far, but I do think that there maybe is a little bit of a link there to that. So what I'm going to do now, same as last week, is we're going to do a model paragraph. This time we're going to do this on Mr. Birling, Arthur Birling, and we're going to do the same question each week pretty much, because I think that this is broad enough that you can then focus in a bit more as you need to. So how is Arthur Birling presented? Not by Arthur. He's not a phone. Why is he a significant character? Good. So like last week, we'll try and focus in on point first, evidence next, technique, explanation, probably some reader response and some context. Now, for some of you sitting some exams, you may not need to put in the context section for an inspector course. So if you're an AQA student, you do. If you're Edexcel or OCR, double check that whether you do or not, because for some parts you do and some parts you don't. I believe for inspector course you don't, but don't quote me on that. Double check your exams, make sure you know which assessment objectives you're hitting. Okay, so we're going to get rid of this. That was the inspector one. And we're going to just very quickly, I think we just about have time. We really don't have some ideas of a few different points. So just remember, in terms of points, there's this list here that can help you. Psychopathic, he's presented as psychopathic. He's presented as selfish. He's presented as a caricature of greedy capitalism. He's presented as the antagonist and so on. I'm going to focus on psychopathic because I think that that's a fairly uncommon one. And I think that this would be a good paragraph for you to try and model. So one of the ways that Mr. Birling is presented is as a psychopathic character. We note this in the phrase, which one shall we do? Lower costs and higher prices. So this is our point. This is our explanation, our evidence. Now we're going into technique and then we're going to go into explanation. So lower costs and higher prices. The juxtaposition of lower costs and, or the juxtaposition of these things, we don't need to rewrite it again, shows the lack of care which Mr. Birling has. And remember, I said you want to really dive deep, since lower costs has connotations of seeing his workforce as merely numbers on a page or on a budget, let's say, numbers on a budget, not thinking about their human needs or giving them any comfort as their boss. So that's very psychopathic. Further, the higher prices denotes his greed and the fact that he doesn't care about charging more than he should or more than customers can easily pay. He doesn't want to benefit them, he only wants to benefit himself. As a reader, we feel upset and against Mr. Birling, forms a protagonist, an antagonistic character. He's a villain, basically, a villain character. This is significant because there are parallels to Hitler and other tyrannical leaders. Just make this a bit smaller. Tyrannical leaders who took power of countries in Europe and showed no care for their enemies. Oh, something like that. So that's all we have time for. That's a pretty solid paragraph to get you going on Arthur Birling. I've given you lots of ideas of what you could talk about for Arthur Birling here as well. So if a question on Arthur Birling comes up, watch this video, remember it, and you've got everything you need for him. All right. Awesome. So I'll catch up with you next week. Take care.